great pleasure to introduce Charlie and Sholeh because they're my Baha'i parents, my spiritual guides, if you like. I first met them when I was left Hong Kong in '87, and I knew them because they were friends of my sister and husband, Jan and Hugh Fixon. And I knew they were in the Solomon Islands, and I wanted to visit a Pacific island. So I contacted them and invited myself to go and stay with them, purely because I needed a reason to visit. And that was a turning point in my life, really, because they were so welcoming and wonderful. And when you're traveling, your mind is clear. And I read 3 or 4 books in the week I was there. So, and that was the start of my Baha'i journey, really. So, but they are both fantastic, intelligent, hardworking people. And Charlie is an architect. He trained in Canterbury and worked in London before he then became a pioneer in the Solomon Islands. And while I was there, he was teaching people there how to use modern techniques with Solomon Island equipment. And I understand that the following typhoon, his was one of the few buildings that was left standing afterwards. So he then had to move to Papua New Guinea to teach there, then back to Australia, both in Townsville and in Perth. And then they moved to Vancouver about 7 years ago. So Sholeh was raised in the Yemen. She trained as a midwife and a nurse in Southampton here in the UK, and met Charlie initially in Henley. She then worked in Africa and the Canadian Development Agency, and then moved with Charlie to the Solomon Islands. And she studied in Australia, got a master's in public health and tropical medicine, and then worked as a nurse and counsellor in breast cancer. 7 years ago, they moved to Vancouver Island, and this was mainly because their daughter Anissa had married a First Nations chap called Doug, who was wonderful, and they moved to be near her. And also Charlie's twin brother was in Canada as well. So Charlie still practices architecture, and Sholeh is now a professor of nursing at Vancouver Island University. So from a Baha'i perspective, they've been responding to the themes of the Universal House of Justice on the Elevate, which is to try and increase conversations to a more meaningful state. And they've been working at this for 10 years, I understand, and I'm very, very keen to hear how they've progressed and how we can incorporate that into our lives as well. So I'd like to hand over to Charlie and Sholeh and look forward to hearing their talk.
Thank you very much, Kathy. That's very generous comments there. To premise this or preface this presentation by talking a little bit about the notion of pioneering. I know that there are people here who are not necessarily familiar with the term pioneering, and it has a particular meaning in the Baha'i community, and typically associated with relocating, as Baha'u'llah says, forsaking your homeland and moving to another country. It's a very interesting idea to suggest that Abdul Baha, who's the son of Baha'u'llah, he speaks about the way that spiritual things are too deep to express in ordinary language. And that's why we talk about things in terms of metaphors and similes. And I've often thought that there is a very interesting simile here between the idea of abandoning your homeland and perhaps thinking about things in a different way. We abandon the homeland of old ideas and attitudes and thinking and actions, and then seek to pioneer new ways of doing things and new ways of approaching the world and looking at it. And I suppose I think of this as the background to the work that we've been doing with this project Elevate. When we were in Solomon Islands, we were very fortunate at the time to be able to visit and attend the dedication of the House of Worship in Samoa with Rihir Khanum and many others. I think Pauline's here as well. Paula's here. She was there. And perhaps others. The significance there was a meeting with a lady called Ruth Mokbelpour. And Ruth was once asked by one of the friends in Samoa, oh, you have to do this work, Missy, because you're the pioneer. And she turned to him and said, well, that's true. I'm living in Samoa. I used to live in Australia or wherever. But we're actually all pioneers, all pioneering new ways of doing things in our own lives, pioneering our own response to the revelation of Baha'u'llah with our family, with our friends at work and school and so on. And I think that probably the most important thing about this particular topic is the idea about pioneering new ideas and new ways forward. Shoghi Effendi, who is the great-grandson of Baha'u'llah, he speaks in a letter in 1974 addressed to friends in Italy about the way that most people in the world don't really know what kind of a world they want to build or how to go about building it. And it's a very interesting concern, of course, because we still have to do something to improve the way that our world is working. But how then do we go about doing it? And perhaps the first thing that we might do about building a new world is to consider what we should be doing. And that means asking questions about it. And it's against that context that I suppose Elevate has kind of grown to be the way that it is. So it's important, first of all, to distinguish this particular project, so it's a service project, from the initiative, the wonderful initiative of the National Spiritual Assembly, which is the organizing body for the Baha'is in the United Kingdom, who have a program which is also called Elevate, which began a year or so ago, which provides resources for devotional gatherings and so on. The program, or the service project Elevate that we refer to here, is essentially a project which gathers and makes available questions to provide meaningful conversation, points of meaningful conversation on topics of interest to Baha'is and of wider social concern. And it's evolved from a very simple idea about how to improve dinner across the dinner table, dinner conversations across the dining table, to evolve into maybe 50 different themes and with maybe 50 or 100 different questions about each of these themes. This material is made freely available, so it's not a commercial project at all. And we'll talk a little bit about its evolution. I'd like to ask Sholeh perhaps if she could reference some quotes from the Universal House of Justice, which is the international representative or administrative body, governing body for the Baha'i community worldwide. These quotations have become more a part of the various messages from the Universal House of Justice over these past 8-10 years. Quite interesting to see reference to meaningful conversation, social discourse, and participation in discourses of society.
The international governing body of the Baha'i faith have given us a few guidance and directions which are really important. And they say, efforts to contribute to social transformation also include participation in the public discourse on issues of concern to humanity, such as peace, the elimination of prejudices of all kinds, the spiritual and moral empowerment of youth, and the promotion of justice. Chief among them are the spiritual education provided to children and youth, opportunities created to deepen understanding of the teachings, gatherings held every month, which we call 19-day feast for the community, and to mark other occasions, efforts made to foster and maintain unity in all matters, assistance offered to young people and families in need, and the time spent visiting with friends and neighbors in their homes, doing what? Engaging in meaningful conversation and weaving bonds of affection and solidarity. So the Elevate project, as Charles has mentioned, we have about over 50 themes which address these issues and give you a whole list of questions and materials and resources to use freely.
When Sholeh and I were living in Western Australia, we would participate in summer schools, gathering family camps for the Baha'is in that part of the world. And one year, we were invited to provide a workshop on creative thinking. It was called Thinking Outside the Nine-Pointed Star. And it was to involve, at the time, the architect for the new house of worship in Santiago, Siamak Hariri. Fabulous architect, fabulous building, as you probably well know. Unfortunately, the technology, because we were living out in the middle of nowhere, the technology meant that we couldn't connect with him. And so we were left with the opportunity then to provide this workshop on creative thinking. And amongst the things that we did was to explore different ways to ask questions about a topic to better understand or learn how we could explore topics in a different way to derive new ideas, which is exactly as Siamak Hariri had suggested he had been working at the beginning of the design for the House of Worship in Santiago. What was fascinating was that when we started this, we didn't know quite where it was going to end up. It wasn't intended to be anything other than a kind of a lightweight exploration of ideas. But at the end of that, the friends were saying, this is really interesting. We should do this again. Come back next year. Yeah. Whoa. So the following year, we did a follow-up. And this one, we were looking at half a dozen questions that we put together and different ways to ask the questions so that we could explore them in more interesting, more nuanced ways again. Western Australian summer school and involved with this workshop and finding that there was fascinating interest in the idea of asking questions in different ways. And we thought, well, maybe what we could do is to invite the friends to suggest questions that they thought would be important for us to be able to talk about. And so that's what we did. We asked them, and what we thought were like 10 questions that we put together suddenly became 20, 50, 100 questions. Oh, what? Good Lord, what was all this? And we thought, well, we've touched on something unusual here. And so we opened up our inquiries to friends, family, and relations around the world. And by doing so, originally there were maybe 50 or 100 questions, suddenly went 2, 3, 4, 500 questions. And we thought, this is overwhelming. And we realized that we ourselves were not really going to be capable of generating sufficient questions to warrant populating the kind of workshops and ideas that we have, so that we were borrowing questions or using and inviting questions that people or others were suggesting. And what went from a simple idea about how to improve table conversations went to a recognition that you could actually explore different questions in the different ways that you could ask them. And we thought, well, maybe we could make this into a game. And so we were making it into a game and then trialing that. And that was quite successful. And so we would then realize that we could turn that into, essentially, it was becoming like a training program for developing skills and confidence in participating in meaningful conversation. And we realized that you could take these sort of 500 or so questions and divide them into different themes. And we could, and then you could focus as you learnt skills and confidence in meaningful conversation while you explore the questions in those themes. And as a result of that, we went from like one very simple one, which is, we refer to it as basic. And the kind of question there was, why might animals make good companions? I mean, it's not a particularly philosophic question, but it's an interesting question because it stimulates your own thinking. And we realized that there is reference or resonance with a quotation from Baha'u'llah where he says, we should regard men or people as a mine rich in gems of inestimable value, and that education alone can bring these gems to light. And we realize that it's much the same with creative thinking, that we're all inherently creative, and that we're bringing into that creativity a whole range of experiences and so forth, unique to our own life, our lives. And that then what we would do is to find a way to pare away the overburden and let those shining gems of creativity come forward. So, for example, you might be walking along the street and suddenly a new idea comes to your mind, or an idea you've been working on comes to mind. Or you change the environment around you, or the things that you eat, or put on special music. We realize that inherently everybody has got an opinion or an idea about a particular topic. And that what we were seeking to do then was to try to draw them out, catalyze them, bring them out through asking appropriate questions. And that really is the essence of what Elevate is, or has become, and where it's going. In order to support that and to sustain it, we then looked at developing new ideas, or not new ideas necessarily, ideas of how to host and hold discussions and conversations with each other, to be able to offer guidelines, not rules or anything like that, that's nonsense, but guidelines as to how better to draw out ideas from each other. And the essence of this is that now the resources of the questions now represent literally hundreds of voices suggesting questions on topics of concern or interest that they have, and that we're able then to make them available. And as such, it's almost like pushing forward the boundaries of contemporary inquiry into these topics. Topics, for example, such as the environment or racism, reconciliation, education, health, and so on. Sholeh has a few here that you can list.
So I guess the list of materials that are being developed and also in progress, anything, as Charles has mentioned, things like the hard choices that we have to make in life, and a bank of questions to go with it. And this is some of the difficult choices we have to make in our lives. The other one is about exploring racism. It's called Healing the Divide. That resource, that's what it's called. Another one on health and healing, exploring aspects of physical and mental well-being. And then there's another one, it's a new world. Well, what does that mean? There's a whole bank of questions of exploring an emerging sense of global community. There's another one, neighborhoods, exploring what helps make a community. Reconciliation, and this would apply in the context of First Nations in a multicultural Canada, for instance, or Australia, or anywhere else that's applicable. There's a whole bank of questions on service, and I can go through some of those questions and you can get an idea of what you might be useful for you. Other things on addiction, agriculture, both wings, which explores gender equality, on death, normalizing conversations regarding a life after life, creativity, exploring dimensions of creativity in its varied expressions. I won't bore you with the rest of the list, but there are many, many themes and resources out there.
We, in order to develop and advance this, we were hoping that we would have a web page and a Facebook account and all of those sort of things that you normally have to do in the modern world. So unfortunately, developing a web page has proved to be quite difficult because you have to really produce these materials at a sufficient level of maturity to warrant putting them up on a web page, and also provide for a web page which is secure and so forth. So we made it a goal that in March or Nowruz of this year in the Baha'i calendar that we would have a Facebook page. And of course, as we all know, all things in the world changed around that time. So we were very fortunate to be able to have a Facebook page available and to be able to post a number of themes which were related to getting through the pandemic and also to explore one of the more, let's say, prominent themes of racism. Did you want to talk a little bit about that?
Yes, that would be fun. Charles mentioned the pandemic, and who doesn't know about this particular period? We're all in it and will be for a while. And it's interesting what the guidance is from the Universal House of Justice, the international governing body of the Baha'i community. And this isn't just for Baha'is, it's for everyone. Anyone who cares to listen and is keen they say, though having to adapt to new circumstances, the friends, that means you and I, have used creative means to strengthen bonds of friendship and to foster among themselves and those known to them spiritual consciousness and qualities of tranquility, confidence, and reliance on God. The elevated conversations that have occurred as a result, whether remotely, as we're doing right now, or in person, have been a source of comfort and inspiration to many. Such efforts on your part provide a valuable service at this hour, when many souls are perplexed and dismayed, unsure of what will be. And this was just in March 2020, just a few months ago, where the House of Justice explained this, and that's why it makes this resources, the Elevate project, very timely as well, because you can, one of the themes is called time out, which we thought, you know, God has given us a bit of a time out to the whole world or whatever. And anyway, let's turn it into positive creativity. And some of the questions can be, actually there's quite a lot, but I'll only give you a few. For instance, what have you learned most from being a member of a family? What for is the greatest challenge facing humanity? And these questions can be around the table with the family or with friends or any place, any space that you care to become creative and use that space to have this meaningful conversations. A question could be, describe your favorite recollection of growing up, because you're with your family, maybe connecting with friends on the phone or by Zoom. Describe your spouse or children's favorite meal or experience. You could be asking, discuss a time you learned something new from your children. That would be a fun one. And also discuss a time, tell us about the time you received really good advice from your parents. You could put that to the kids or junior youth or whatever space you happen to be in. And another one is, if you could relive your childhood, what might you change? And the list goes on. So it's a question of being flexible and responsive, whether it's junior youth or children or families or acquaintances, or you're trying to strike up a conversation that's meaningful, and learning more about each other and establishing relationships. That's what it's all about.
One of the interesting things that we found was that when we have, or Sholeh and I might coordinate this from our little computer and stuff over on Vancouver Island, we have a number of people around the world who are kind of like supporters, acolytes, or whatever you want to call them. So when we have these discussions about these topics, for example, we discussed the questions about the environment. It gave rise to a new kind of theme, which was to do with consumer affairs. And that led to the idea that we'd make a list of topics that children could ask their parents about, interrogate their parents. How did you come to choose the car that you now drive? How did you come to decide your holiday last year? what are the decisions that you made about financing your house and so on?
And the values.
And based on values, economic values and environmental values. I mean, how many times do you actually ask your parents, or have you asked your parents, or have you discussed these things in that manner? And what we're providing here through this resource is the opportunity for people to provide those or to ask those questions, to have those conversations. And it helps both in actually develop that kind of bonding within the family, between generations and peers, and also helps to explore the actual ideas themselves. So you can make a better and informed decision about a car, about a house, about a holiday, about a book, whatever it might be.
Career.
And in order to do that, we have also provided for this material to be formatted in the form of either strips, which you can print and fold and put in like straws in a vase on the dining table and pull them out at random when the conversation at the dining table is kind of running flat, or as little cards, and then in a kind of a format of a game, where you literally pull a different set of cards at random to identify someone who would lead a conversation. They're just simply ways to generate interest and to actually talk about topics of interest and concern. And at the same time, invite people to contribute their responses to this, their ideas, how they used it, so that that material can come back and gradually enrich and improve the program and make it available again, and continuously be looking at pushing back the boundaries or the limits to knowledge or understanding or interest, so that we can gradually turn what we might call, let's say, individual opinion into something effectively like a collective wisdom. We do that by offering these materials being used for personal reflection, should you wish, or small group discussions, or workshops, that's right, at summer schools, in support of larger conferences and so on, around the family dining table, for ice breaking. For example, last year, earlier this year, the friends in Croydon were using this material in one of the Nowruz celebrations, and last year doing the same thing. Last year we were using this, or we were asked to provide the material to the World Wildlife Fund in Australia, a list of questions there to help stimulate their little group thinking in Australia at their conference. And that we've been in discussion with Brian about the possibilities of working in Guyana with the prison authorities through the School of Nations to help prisoners become more reflective and aware of the possibilities and gradually develop confidence, so that when they go back into the wider community, they are better equipped and feel safer and stronger about how they can participate in the wider community after their time in prison. Now, this is still in the process of discussion and exploration. But we're trying to say here that what we've touched on is something really kind of unusual and unique, and that it has terrific opportunities in ways that we don't really know yet, and opportunities that are arriving almost every day. We'd like somebody, for example, to put their hand up and maybe write something for the children, an equivalent for children. The materials themselves are written on a very non-partisan basis for people of any and no tradition of faith. They're at the kind of level of, let's say, comprehension for junior youth and above. It'd be nice to have a children's one. We've been exploring the idea of having elevate children's clubs at schools, so that you can encourage the children at school to be able to look at questions and become more engaged rather than on the phone or whatever else there is. And the more recently, an interesting idea came up about the golden years in your life, the way that you might be able to reflect on your life, make a timeline of your life, convert that or have it converted into a series of questions. So it's a bit like a TV interview with Michael Parkinson or whatever. And the idea being then that you could interrogate that person about their life and learn about them, understand why they made the decisions that they made, And it may be, and it's a bit like, yeah, the Japanese, they talk about the human library, that's right. And maybe the same thing, you have somebody that might sit in a shopping mall, and you can ask them if they, for example, African American, tell me about your experience as an African American about racism or whatever, or reconciliation. The point being that Baha'u'llah speaks very clearly, I mean, for no reason, he speaks about questions and speech and language as being of such importance in this revelation, in this time. And that and it's not without good reason that he does that, and that we are encouraged to explore ideas and to commit ourselves to that. And Sholeh is going to say a few more things, and we're almost finished.
Well, just another quotation, which is a great reminder of why this has given impetus to this work, is that the House of Justice say, while eschewing partisan political activity, Baha'is are to vigorously engage in constructive public discourse and in a wide range of social endeavors aimed at the betterment of the world and the progress of their respective nations. They undertake such activities with humility, discernment, and respect for prevailing laws and social conditions. In a spirit of learning and in collaboration with like-minded groups and individuals, fully confident in the power inherent in the principle of unity in diversity and in the efficacy of mutual aid and cooperation. The friends, that's you and I, all of us here, are also developing their capacity for engaging those around them, regardless of creed, culture, class, or ethnicity, in conversations about how to bring about spiritual and material well-being through systematic application of the divine teachings. One gratifying result of this growing capacity is the community's increased ability to make meaningful contributions to various important discourses prevalent in society. In certain countries, leaders and thinkers striving to address the challenges confronting their societies increasingly show appreciation of the perspective offered by Baha'is. We know as Baha'is, we serve and we contribute on to the learning and deliberations of various committees on the United Nations, and addressing major themes that address this, that will be utilized to promote unity of mankind and preserving its diversity and enhancing its unity.
The Universal House of Justice also writes in their message in 2010, they describe how access to knowledge is the right of every human being. And it's interesting that for most people, we always like to think, oh, education and literacy makes it possible for us to, we can just read it all up and learn and get access to knowledge. Actually, that's very difficult. Not only do maybe however many percent, Arthur, I'm sure, would know the numbers on literacy around the world is difficult for a lot of people who don't have access to school to be able to simply read things. Not only read things, but read and understand them and realize what's being said. And those materials themselves have been slewed in favor of the person who's writing them, and then to interpret them and then to apply them to be able to advance the interests of civilization. What we've sort of been touching on the idea of is that you could perhaps represent questions or knowledge in the form of questions that you yourselves can reflect on and realize, yes, I have an opinion about this, without having to go so deeply into the whole kind of academic rhetoric that's involved with deep thesis or reading theses and ideas and reports and so forth. And that simply being able to sit around the campfire or the dining table, whatever it is, and to talk about these topics itself is an exercise that releases inherent wisdom, inherent experience, inherent creative thinking, ideation, and so on within, and allows that then to come forth. So what we are inviting you to do, if we may, is to contribute to this project by suggesting the questions that you think we should be talking about in our daily lives, around the dining table, with our family and friends, about topics of concern and general interest, both to Baha'is and of the wider community, to be able to invite you, or inviting you to contribute your shoulder to the wheel, to push forward and push back the limits that there are, or constraints there are to current understanding. What are the questions that you think are important to ask about the environment, about neighborhoods, about the education of children? What are the questions that you think are important that we should be talking about to address issues of poverty, of agriculture, of development, about refugees? I mean, don't rely on us. We are simply two voices and a handful of friends around the world who have got ideas and put these things together. The more voices that we have, the more nuanced, the richer, the more valuable, and the more relevant becomes the conversations that we can have and we can call on.
I should also mention that just looking through the questions in the chat, it's fine saying these, everyone understands that these elevated conversations are important. We get that. How do we get hold of these resources? Yes. Well, they had to be developed from scratch. And we've said there's a list, and I've had a question asking, how can we get this resource list? Well, we are in the process of the web page for Elevated Conversation. It's singular, it's not an S, unfortunately we couldn't put the S, it was used up. So it's just Elevated Conversation. I know there are many conversations, but. So look on Facebook, Elevated Conversation, and you'll see the logo that you just had on the ad that Mojgan has kindly prepared, that you've seen today. It was designed by Pete McGuire, which we're very grateful to, and many others who've contributed to this and helped. Anyway, on that Facebook page, you'll see resources that as they've been developed, we've developed them, we've posted them. So you can access a few of them, and we will endeavor to find a way to put the entire list up. But it's just two people working away at it, over the time, putting those questions out to others like yourselves who are interested. We'll pick up a theme and they'll work on it. The web page has been a challenge because you need a finished product, and this is organic. I think it takes a while to figure out that it's unending. It's a mine that's rich with gems that we are mining, developing. It's organic and developing. And it's like that blood circulation. It goes, pumps in, and you get a feedback mechanism, and it comes back, and you get more questions and more inquiries. So it's evolving. It's an evolving situation. So there is no website at the moment. I would love to have one. Mm-hmm. It is being developed though. And slowly at early stages, we found someone who's willing to be the admin, because we'd like to build sustainability into this project, obviously.
Well, it's become bigger than just, a handful of people. It's taken on a life of its own. And in order to make it more effective and efficient, we have to be able to, in some ways, automate it or make it more, take it away from the limits of human or fallibility. There is a Facebook page, yes, but there is an email address.
Yes, what is it?
And the email address is elevatedconversation@gmail.com. Asking the right question is half the answer. The right question, half the answer. And from Einstein, computers can only give you answers.
Not questions.
Yeah, not questions. They can only give you answers. So there we are.